Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Tony. I'm with the with the Firm Foundation. And yeah, thanks for the nice words. I was working a lot on the data stuff, but today's talk is very different. I want to talk a little bit about one of the buckets that Julian already introduced, namely scaling the L1. In particular, I want to focus on block validation and how we can introduce some form of parallelism to ensure that validators can attest to a block earlier, giving us more time in the slot and allowing us to then scale the gas limit. Just to quickly set the stage, what I'm going to talk about. When we talk about scaling, there are basically two levers we have. We can scale the gas limit and we can scale blobs. And today, I don't want to focus on blobs that much. It will only focus on the gas limit, because blobs we will get in Fusaka. We will get the PeerDAS EAP that will scale the blobs. And then hopefully Glamsterdam, which is the name of the EAP that will come after Fusaka, we will hopefully get the first EAPs in there that help us with scaling the gas limit. When we talk about scaling, I think we can differentiate between three different timelines. First, short-term scaling. We have some repricings there, some client optimizations. Essentially, clients are constantly optimizing their code bases, allowing us to already scale. For example, the 36 million gas limit increase from 30 million. This was basically made possible by clients optimizing their code bases, just giving us more room and then allowing us to scale the gas limit. Second, midterm changes involve protocol changes, some EAPs that, for example, restructure how we use the time in the slot, or do other things like what I'm going to talk about, parallelism. And then long term, everyone has probably at some point heard of CKVMs. This is kind of the promise of the long-term scaling roadmap, that at some point we might be able to swap out the EVM as we know it today with a CKVM, and then validators only need to verify proofs instead of executing the whole block. And again, I will focus on the midterm stuff here, protocol changes, in particular EAP 7928, block level access lists, and how we can use it to get some form of parallelism. Yeah, as already said, block level access lists, it's a very fresh EAP. You can see it here at the date created. It's a few months old only. So it's I would say very much in draft stage still, but we got the feeling that because L1 scaling become way more and more important in the recent year or months, that it looks kind of good that we might do some EAP that scales the L1 in the fork next year. And block level access list is one of the proposed candidates there. There are other candidates you might have heard of, like ePBS, delayed execution, and so on, that are all focused on scaling the L1, and block level access lists is also part of that list. So let's get into how it works. So today, on this slide, you can see how transaction execution works today. This is, of course, a very naive picture how it works, because under the hood, clients might do some different things, but in the end, it always ends up with first doing some I/O. You have to go to your disk, load some stuff into your cache, and then you can start executing the transaction. And what we end up with, looking kind of at this Gantt chart, which shows you a whole block, at this sequential execution. So you execute the first transaction, then you execute the second transaction, you execute the third transaction, and so on. And this is because every transaction could rely on the previous one. For example, the first transaction touches the wrapped ETH pool, then the second transaction needs to know what's the balance in the wrapped ETH pool. So you can't really execute the second transaction at the same time with the first transaction, because you rely on the execution result of the first transaction. And of course, it would be way cooler if we get to a world where it looks like this, where you can basically parallelize all transactions in the block. So no matter how many cores you have, assuming you have an infinite number of cores, then you should be able to parallelize all transactions, which would mean the whole execution time would not be sequential anymore, but essentially the execution time of the heaviest transaction in your block. We could go even further. We could even parallelize between I/O and execution, which would mean you could start executing the block without even going to disk first. So this would mean I would give you all the values in the block that you need to start execution, before you even have to look up what the value of a certain storage slot is right now on disk. Of course, this would come with some async validation if the values you got in the block are actually correct, but theoretically this would perfectly work too. And this brings me to this topic of block level access lists, because block level access lists try to exactly give us some form of parallelization, no matter if it's parallelization between I/O and execution or parallelization between transaction execution. In the end, the goal is just to make everything faster. Yeah, I already saw some builders here in the room, and I think it's very important that we have builders on our side here, because in the end, someone needs to build the block and put those block level access lists into the block. I think it's very easy to do, so it's not that much work, but this will basically be dependent on builders. So builders are forced by consensus to build block level access lists, so they become part of the consensus, which means the access list a builder puts into the block must be fully correct. It's not allowed to put more in there that is needed or to leave any storage slot out there. So we use builders, we outsource some work to builders, they give validators basically a small cheat sheet how to best execute the block, and we kind of shift some work that is usually done by validators, namely finding out what is the best execution path. We move it over to builders, and builders will then be able to tell validators exactly the most optimal way to execute the block. But as already said, this should be very minimal effort, so it will not be hurting local building or anything, because this will be possible on any low-end device too. So how would it look like? Today, actually, the block looks like this. It's a very easy picture here. I left out some stuff just for simplicity, but essentially we have a block, it has a header, it has transactions, some withdrawals, and so on. And with block level access lists, we would just add a new field to the block, which would be the block level access list, and a small hash into the header. And the block level access list in this picture would contain the storage locations and a state diff. The storage locations are essentially telling you what you actually, what you actually will see in the block. So addresses and storage slots are basically what you will touch during the block execution. And this is what I mean with the storage location. So you will already know, okay, this block will touch, for example, the Uniswap pool, it will touch the wrapped ETH contract, and so on. This is already quite nice because you can then parallelize I/O, because if you know upfront what the block will touch, you can already parallelize that. So before starting execution, you can already be like, okay, I use the storage locations, I go to disk in parallel, I put everything into my cache, and then I start executing. It's quite nice for parallelization for average cases, but of course, if you think of worst case blocks, where every transaction depends on the previous one, then this doesn't actually give you anything. You would be able to see that this is a block that is not parallelizable, but then, yeah, you don't really get anything out of it. So for average blocks that are quite independent, like 80% of the transactions are fully independent today, that means like they don't rely on the previous transactions. For that cases, this will be already enough, right? Because we can already parallelize average blocks quite well today. The problem is more like the worst cases where really we have a chain of dependencies within the block, every transaction relying on the previous one, and then having the storage locations will essentially give you nothing. So what we also need is some values. And here the design space is rather big, because what you can think of here is what would you need as a value for the storage slot. For example, the pre-block versus the post-block value, which would be, the pre-block would be, for example, this value of a certain storage slot, for example, the wrapped ETH balance of a certain contract before the block or after the block. And then you can zoom in a little further and be, okay, pre-transaction versus post-transaction, which would be the value of a certain storage slot pre and post your transaction execution. And I will come to that in a second, because this matters a lot when it comes to what you can actually parallelize in the end, and also how it affects the block size. The next thing we can do is state diffs. So now we talked about storage locations and some values, but the next thing is state diffs. So state diffs is basically everything that changes on state during the block execution. And we might also, when we already talk about storage, right, then what is missing to get from storage diffs to a full state diff? And essentially it's nonces and balances. So if you end code, but code is kind of negligible here, so if you have nonce and balance diffs in addition to the storage diff, then you end up with a full state diff. And this is kind of cool because if you have a full state diff, you can do many more things than just parallelization with it. I will come to that in a second too. So the question is, which design is best? We talked about storage locations, we talked about the values, pre, post, transaction, block values, and so on. So there's many different ways how we can now implement the block level access lists. And this picture shows you this design trade-off between post-transaction values and pre-transaction values. So on the left-hand side, you can see having post-transaction values, you can perfectly parallelize transaction. Perfectly parallelize in the sense that no transaction is dependent on the previous one. But the thing is, if you don't get the values up front, but you only get the values after each transaction, then you cannot parallelize between I/O and EVM. So execution time here becomes parallel I/O plus parallel EVM. On the right-hand side, this looks even more promising because here the block level access lists would contain the values before executing a certain transaction, and then you can arrive at an execution time that is the maximum of the parallel I/O and parallel EVM. So just from this picture, you might say, okay, the right-hand side is definitely better than the left-hand side. The only problem here is the worst case sizes. So if I have to give you every storage value that you will find on disk, then the worst case size, of course, increases. The worst case is kind of easy to compute. You would basically take the gas limit times the cost of an S load, and this would give you how many storage slots can a certain block touch. And then doing very simple math, you would end up at a maximum block size of 1.51 megabyte, and this is larger than what you get with call data. So here it might make sense to move to the left-hand side. Don't focus too much on the pre-transaction values, but instead the post-transaction values, and thereby getting away smaller block level access list size that is smaller than the call data, than the worst case block that you can create with call data. And this is kind of important here because if we stay below the worst case call data block, we don't have to think that much about increased DOS risks from big blocks or anything, because the worst case would still be the call data block and not the block level access lists block. And both are mutually exclusive. You can either, so if you want to DOS the network, you can either do one of them. You can build a big block level access list, which means you have to actually do a lot of storage operations, or you can build a block with a lot of call data, but you have the gas only once. You can only use it either for storage access or for call data. And as long as we stay below the call data size, it shouldn't be a problem for increased DOS risks or anything. So in this table, you can see a quick summary of some different design choices, and the two we just discussed are the last ones. The post-transaction values with the storage locations and the state diff, and actually the second one with the pre-transaction values. The cool thing is that the third one also contains a full state diff. And this state diff is very valuable for other things, like, for example, you could use it for executionless nodes that are still serving RPC requests. Also, this is a very interesting chart here. If you have storage locations plus the state diff, of course, the size of that object grows. Without the storage locations, we would end up with only a post-transaction state diff, and then the sizes are actually quite manageable. So you see it spikes at around 30 kilobytes, which would mean on average we would add like 30 additional kilobytes to each block. A block today is around 80 to 100 kilobytes, so you could say around 20 to 30% more or 20 to 30% bigger blocks in the end. Whereas with adding storage locations, you would additionally add, or you would almost double that. And then you would add like 40, 50 kilobytes in addition to today's blocks. Also, the block level access list scales quite linearly, which is kind of problematic, I would say. It will never scale super linearly. This is impossible just because of the design of the block level access lists. But as you can see in this picture, we see a slow decrease in scale when we go to higher or blocks consuming more gas. But it's a very, it's not like that it flattens out very quickly. So increasing the gas limit will also increase the size of the block level access lists. And this is something we have to be very careful about because, of course, we could use this additional size that we now need for bandwidth, for latency and everything. We could also just use it to scale the gas limit and fit more transactions into a block. Right, so to quickly summarize, block level access lists, we want to have them for speeding up block validation. We use builders to provide the information needed to eventually parallelize the transaction execution. And also the full state diff gives us other things like executionless nodes. I already mentioned it briefly, where you run a node that doesn't do any execution, but you might still want to do RPC requests. And then you need some way to go from the pre-state to the post-state without execution. And this is not really possible today. You would always need the state diff for that. And in this design of 7.9.28, you would essentially get that within the block. So you would download a block, and then this block would allow you to move from the pre-state to the post-state without any execution. Furthermore, you would get something like faster indexing. Many people are complaining about indexing balances or stuff because it's sometimes not that easy to get to historical balances if you're not running an archive node. And by having basically the balance diff in every block, it's very simple to just derive the historical balance of a certain address by applying the balance diffs backwards. And finally, block level access lists might also give us some speed up in syncing because you can use them in the healing phase of syncing and catch up to the tip of the chain very quickly and then check if you're still on the right chain. So they would not come with any proof or witness, but in the end you will still be able to verify that the sync was correct. And this is all I have here. Thanks a lot. And I put some further readings on that slide. So if you want to dive in deeper, just feel free to scan the QR codes. And as said, feel free to also reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you want to contribute to the EAP, also happy to welcome you. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Hello, hello. Thanks a lot, Tony. Are there any questions from the audience? No, all right. Oh, there, Lynn. Nice.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. One question I have is, does this affect the gas metering from each transactions? Because you have some idea of what state are offline touched or not, and.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it will. So we haven't really gotten to that part yet. As said, the ERP is still very fresh, but I think this will definitely affect the metering, probably affect the metering too. And then based on shipping block level access lists, we might need some repricings, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I'm not too familiar with all of this stuff, but I'm wondering if block builders now have to include these state diffs and stuff like this. Is that going to require more computation from them?
So I have been talking with builders about this, like how much they think this would kind of make their job more complex. And all the builders I've talked to so far were saying, yeah, this is not really something that would make their life much harder. And this is very important here because we don't want to only outsource that to professional, sophisticated builders, but it must be possible to do that for local building too. So there is some additional work that comes with it, but it's essentially you build a block and you just keep track of everything you touched, of some of the values. So as the block builder, you know exactly what happened in your block, and then you put this into the block. Of course, the block would then grow in size, which would mean it might take longer to propagate. But in the end, just from a computational standpoint, it's very simple. From a bandwidth and latency standpoint, I would say we still have to kind of do some measurements to see if the sizes of that objects are kind of a problem. I would assume it's not really a problem because 30 kilobytes, this is like a fourth of a block. So still kind of contained, but definitely something to focus on in the next month to get those numbers.
Is there anything that a malicious builder could do to like somehow sabotage the block level access list they're including?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is no, because the block level access needs to be fully correct. So this means if a builder tries to cheat, for example, leaving out some stuff, putting into the block level access list an incomplete state diff, or even building a super big block level access list without actually touching the storage slot claimed in the block level access list, then the block would turn invalid. So essentially, if you want to get your block on chain, it has to be valid, and also valid in terms of the block level access list needs to be fully valid.
All right, final moment for some last questions. Otherwise, thanks a lot, Tony.
Thank you.